Maya's thoughts are interrupted by the harsh buzzing of her radio, a routine traffic stop. She adjusts her shoulders and straightens her uniform. The weight of the day, the microaggressions, and the constant battle against the biases she faces weighs on her, but she pushes it aside. This is what she does, she's good at it. But something in her gut twists as she drives toward the scene. When she arrives, the first thing she sees is Officer Thompson, his bulky frame towering over a young black man who looks no older than 20, his hands raised in submission. The air around them crackles with tension. Thompson's voice is sharp, his words harsh. Maya's instincts immediately pick up on the escalating tone, the lack of calm in Thompson's approach. This isn't just a routine stop. She pulls up quietly, stepping out of the car. Her eyes narrow. She's seen this before. The aggression, the disregard for de-escalation, the power trip. Thompson's back is to her, and he's leaning in, his hand dangerously close to the man's wrist, already making movements toward the cuffs. Maya's mind races. She knows what this is. The risk. The possibility of another unnecessary escalation. She has to step in, but fear pulses through her veins. The tension in her chest is familiar, because she knows she's seen this before. Because this is always the moment where she's either too much or not enough. She approaches slowly, her voice clear, commanding. "Officer Thompson, hold on. This doesn't need to go any further." Thompson's head jerks slightly in her direction, his eyes flashing with irritation. "This one's making trouble. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Maya steps closer, trying to project authority without anger. "He hasn't done anything wrong. Let him go." Thompson's lips curl into a tight sneer. "I don't need your help, Williams. Go back to your car." The disrespect stings. She's heard this before. The not needing help from men who see her as an outsider, an intruder. But her voice remains steady, though every word feels like a battle. "This situation is under control. There's no reason to escalate this." He steps forward, blocking her path. "You're out of line. Just back off." Maya feels the ground shifting beneath her. Her body responds before her mind does, but she forces her voice to stay even. "You're escalating this. He's not resisting. Why don't you take a moment to think about that?" Thompson looks her up and down with clear disdain. He reaches for the cuffs, the sharp clink of metal echoing in the street, and before Maya can stop him, he slaps them onto her wrists with a force that sends a ripple of shock through her body. The young man, his eyes wide with disbelief, watches. The crowd of onlookers grows, some murmuring, others pulling out their phones. Maya's heart pounds in her chest. She can't believe it. She's being arrested by a fellow officer in front of witnesses. A black woman in uniform now treated like a criminal by the very people she works with. Her mind reels in confusion, in fury. She's no longer just Maya Williams, the detective. She's a black woman with her hands cuffed, standing in front of a crowd, the shame heavy in her chest. "What are you doing?" Maya finally breathes, her voice trembling despite the composure she's trying to hold on to. Thompson, breathing heavily, looks at her as if she's the one who's wrong. "You've gone too far, Williams. Step back." Amira locked eyes with the officer, but she didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice clear, a quiet storm brewing within her. "I'm standing up for what's right." A figure stepped forward from the crowd. He was older, a man of considerable stature, Malcolm Hayes. He had been watching from the sidelines, his military training making him acutely aware of the power dynamics at play. When he saw the shove, something inside him broke. He couldn't stand by any longer. He stepped toward the officer, his posture firm, unwavering. "That's enough," Malcolm's voice boomed, cutting through the tension like a knife. His presence was an immovable force between Amira and Officer Dunn, his body a shield. The officer hesitated for a moment, his anger flaring but now met with resistance that wasn't afraid. The moment stretched as Officer Dunn's hand twitched, as if considering a second shove. But instead, he tried to push past Malcolm. He didn't anticipate the speed or precision with which Malcolm would react. In one swift movement, Malcolm redirected Dunn's force, using his body to twist the officer off balance. Dunn's feet lost their grip and suddenly he was on the ground, his weapon slipping from his hand. For a heartbeat there was silence. The world seemed to pause as Dunn lay there on the pavement, his ego shattered. His authority, once so powerful, had crumbled in an instant. And in that moment, Amira stood tall, not just as a business owner or an activist, but as a symbol of resistance. The crowd, once fearful, now roared in a wave of collective triumph. Phones continued to roll, capturing every second, every ounce of power shifting. What had begun as a singular act of resistance was now a moment of reckoning. Amira's voice rang out again, this time stronger, more resolute. "This is why we don't stay silent. This is why we fight." Her words were a call to action, and they echoed through the crowd, igniting something powerful. The officer, still lying on the ground, struggled to regain his composure. His eyes burned with rage, but he knew something had changed. The optics of the situation had shifted. The world was watching, and the power that he had once wielded so effortlessly had been taken from him. The crowd that had been scattered in the streets slowly began to gather, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Some held their phones up, silently recording the scene, while others hung back, unsure whether to step forward. A heavy tension filled the air as Amira stumbled backward, caught off guard by the shove. But in an instant, she regained her footing, steadying herself on the sidewalk. Her gaze locked with Officer Dunn's, not with fear, but with a quiet defiance. The teenager, who had been at the center of the confrontation, stood frozen, his wide eyes darting between the officer and Amira, unsure of what would come next. The officer's presence loomed large, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, ready to enforce his authority. But Amira stood there, unyielding, her spine straight, her posture radiating the strength she had always carried deep within her. "Why are you harassing this kid?" Amira's voice rang out, calm but firm, piercing the tension that clung to the air. Her words were not a question for the officer to answer. They were a challenge, a demand for accountability. But Officer Dunn didn't take kindly to being questioned. His eyes narrowed, his lip curled into a sneer as he turned his attention to Amira. "Mind your own business," he growled, stepping toward her, the weight of his uniform making his every move more imposing. Amira didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward, her phone now raised in her hand, pointing it directly at the officer. "I'm recording this," she said, her voice steady. "You don't get to do this without people seeing it." The crowd held its breath. Some of them took out their own phones, capturing the moment, while others exchanged looks of unease. The air seemed to crackle with anticipation. Amira knew this could escalate. She had seen it too many times. But she couldn't walk away. Not this time. Not when the system had been so clearly broken for so long. The officer's face twisted with anger. "You think you can just film me like that?" he barked. He took a step toward her, his hand now resting just above his gun. "You're interfering with police duties." Amira's heart raced, but her voice remained calm. "I'm standing up for what's right. You can't intimidate me into silence." Before the words even left her mouth, another voice broke through the growing tension. A man in the crowd, his broad shoulders and intense gaze hard to ignore, stepped forward. His name was Malcolm Hayes, a former military man who had witnessed too many injustices himself. Seeing Amira, a woman who had always fought for the voiceless, standing her ground in the face of such blatant aggression, stirred something deep within him. "Back off." Malcolm's voice was low, commanding. His eyes locked with Officer Dunn's, the same fiery resolve that burned in Amira's chest, now reflected in his. "You've pushed enough." Officer Dunn's face reddened with rage. He didn't take kindly to being questioned by anyone, least of all a civilian. His hand shot out, attempting to shove Malcolm the same way he had Amira. But what Dunn didn't expect was the military training Malcolm had spent years honing. With a swift move, Malcolm redirected Dunn's force, using the officer's own momentum against him. In the blink of an eye, Officer Dunn lost his balance. His feet slipped out from under him, and he fell backward onto the pavement with a thud. His weapon clattered beside him, a symbol of his lost power. For a moment, everything was still. The crowd, which had been watching with bated breath, now let out a collective gasp, followed by stunned silence. The officer who had once wielded power with impunity was now lying on the ground, his face twisted with disbelief. The silence was broken by a single voice, then another, then more, until the entire crowd erupted into a roar of disbelief, excitement, and triumph. The officer, so used to enforcing fear, was now at the mercy of the very people he had sought to control. Phones flashed as the moment was captured from every angle. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, and the crowd felt emboldened, no longer passive witnesses to injustice, but active participants in the fight against it. Amira stood tall, her heart pounding but her spirit unwavering. She looked around, seeing the faces of those who had been watching, unsure whether to act. Now they were united in a single purpose. They were not just bystanders. They were standing up for what was right. In the midst of the chaos, another officer arrived on the scene, his hand instinctively going to his gun as he assessed the situation. But when he saw the gathering crowd and the cameras rolling, his posture softened. He knew that the optics of the moment were not in his favor. Amira didn't let the moment slip by. She walked toward the camera, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is why we don't stay silent," she said, her words powerful, calm, and deliberate. "This is what happens when we stop accepting the system as it is. We rise." Her words echoed in the crowd as they began chanting, their voices rising in unison. The officer on the ground, humiliated and enraged, struggled to get back to his feet. His eyes burned with fury, but he knew something had shifted. The city was watching, the world was watching, and the old ways of control were no longer enough to silence those who had been oppressed for too long. Amira didn't need an apology from Officer Dunn. She had already found her voice, and with it, the strength to challenge the system that had long been stacked against her and so many others. The city felt heavy. The air, thick with the hum of daily life, carried an underlying current of uncertainty. People walked briskly, their eyes darting, as if bracing themselves for what might happen next. The recent events, the protests, the news reports, the rumors, hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Even in places where tension hadn't yet surfaced, it was there, palpable, whispering from every corner, every street. It was in the way people looked at each other, the way they looked at the police. Amira Jackson knew this feeling too well. As a 32-year-old black woman who had spent her life fighting for justice, the city felt both like home and like a battleground. Her cafe, a gathering place for those who needed to find solace, knowledge, and strength in a world that often tried to silence them, had become a sanctuary, but it was also a place where the weight of systemic oppression never ceased to linger. Her business was a lifeline for the community, a place where she helped. Young people understand their worth, their power, but it came at a cost. Tonight, Amira was just trying to get some groceries. It was meant to be a simple errand, something she could do to unwind after a long day of community work. But as she stepped outside the cafe, the familiar unease settled in her chest. The streets were quieter than usual, and a strange stillness hung in the air. It felt like a moment of calm before a storm. Amira walked into the convenience store with her mind still running through her thoughts about the cafe, her customers, the work left unfinished. She didn't know that when she left the store, her life would change forever. Outside, the scene was unfolding. A teenage boy stood, backed up against a wall, his eyes wide with fear. Officer Bradley Dunn, his posture rigid and aggressive, was shouting at him, his voice rising with each word. Amira's heart sank. This was too familiar. She knew the fear in the boy's eyes. She had seen it too many times. "Why are you bothering him?" Amira's voice was steady as she approached. Her feet moving before her mind had fully processed what she was doing. The officer turned, his expression hardened, annoyed by the interruption. "Mind your own business," he snapped, his hand resting too casually on his baton. Amira's gaze didn't falter, meeting his with quiet defiance. "I'm making it my business," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "What's going on here?" Dunn's jaw clenched as he stepped forward, a threatening edge creeping into his tone. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "This doesn't concern you." But Amira wasn't backing down. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, her fingers steady. "I think it does," she said, her eyes locked on his. I'm recording this." The officer's face twisted into a sneer, his patience wearing thin. "Are you really going to film me? You think I'm going to let you interfere with my duties?" "I'm not interfering, I'm documenting," Amira shot back. Dunn's irritation boiled over. He took a step toward her, and before Amira could react, he shoved her hard, sending her stumbling back. The force of it shocked her, but she caught herself, her body aching from the impact. Her heart hammered in her chest. The crowd, previously silent, began to murmur. The air grew heavy with tension. Amira stood tall even as the world seemed to tilt. She wasn't going to let this moment pass. The shove wasn't just against her. It was against the countless people who had been pushed down by the very system that Dunn represented. It was a symbol of every injustice she'd ever fought against. The crowd, who had been quiet, now stirred. People stepped forward, phones raised, the action captured in real time. The teenager, his face filled with both fear and awe, watched as Amira steadied herself, her gaze never leaving Dunn. She wasn't just standing up for herself now. She was standing up for everyone who had been shoved down, ignored, or dismissed. Her resistance had sparked something in the crowd, a shared power. "Not today," came a voice from the crowd. Amira turned slightly to see a man stepping forward. Malcolm Hayes, an ex-military veteran, moved with purpose. He had been watching the whole thing, his frustration building. He wasn't going to let this go. Malcolm's stance was firm as he walked toward Officer Dunn. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. Dunn, still seething, sneered at Malcolm. "This is none of your business." "I beg to differ," Malcolm responded, his voice a calm thunder that demanded respect. He stepped directly between Amira and Dunn, his presence creating a wall of resistance. Dunn, his ego bruised, tried to push past him, but Malcolm wasn't budging. In a swift movement, Dunn attempted to shove Malcolm just as he had done to Amira. But Malcolm, with his military training, redirected the officer's force. In an instant, Officer Dunn lost his balance, stumbling backward, his hand slipping off his baton. The crowd gasped. Dunn hit the ground hard, the sound of it echoing down the street. For a moment, there was silence. The officer, who had once towered over everyone, lay on the ground, vulnerable. The power dynamic had shifted. Then the crowd erupted. It was a wave of disbelief, of relief, of shock and defiance. The phones, already recording, captured every second. What had started? Here's a simple act of resistance had now become a symbol, a turning point in the battle for justice. Amira stood still, her heart still racing, but she was no longer shaking. She was stronger than she'd ever been. "This is why we don't stay silent," she said, her voice ringing out, cutting through the noise. The officer struggled to get to his feet, his eyes burning with rage, but it was clear that the tide had turned. Amira's words, her defiance, had ignited something in the crowd. They weren't passive witnesses anymore. They were part of this moment, part of this resistance. The world was watching, and Amira knew that the story had changed. The crowd, once hesitant, was now united. They weren't just witnesses, they were standing with her. This wasn't just her fight. It was theirs. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt like it was pushing in from all sides, heavy with expectation. The judge cleared his throat, the sound of it echoing in the stillness. As the verdict was read, it felt like the weight of the entire room shifted, collectively exhaling. "Not guilty," the judge said, and Malcolm's acquittal hung in the air like a beacon, a long-awaited light breaking through the clouds. The room erupted. Malcolm's supporters, those who had fought alongside him, stood to their feet, their cheers mingling with sighs of relief. In the distance, a few people held their heads in quiet awe, some even wiping away tears. But for Amira, the victory felt bittersweet. Yes, it was a moment of triumph. Yes, it was a victory for Malcolm. Yes, it was justice, however delayed. But she knew this was only the beginning. The judge had spoken of self-defense, but what he didn't say, what no one had said aloud, was that it had taken everything to get to this point. Years of systemic oppression, decades of unchecked power, and countless souls left to suffer. It was a small victory, but it was still victory. The police department, once so confident in its shield, now faced public outrage. The news was buzzing, but not with excitement over the case. They were talking about Officer Dunn, about his dismissal, from the force, about the investigation that was now underway into his conduct. It was uncomfortable. It was necessary. And finally, it was happening. Outside the courtroom, the city was already shifting. The work wasn't done. Amira could feel the energy in the streets, the whispers of a new kind of hope rippling through the community. She turned to Malcolm, who stood beside her, his face still taut with the emotions of the day. "We've got work to do," Amira said, her voice steady but determined. Malcolm nodded. "We've only just begun." Amira didn't stop after the trial. She couldn't. The fight for Malcolm's freedom wasn't the end of the story. It was just the spark. With each passing day, she used the platform she had built, the cafe she had poured her heart into, as a headquarters for justice. What had once been a place of refuge and conversation had now become the heart of the resistance. She opened its doors for legal aid, for town halls, for rallies. The walls, once adorned with inspirational posters of civil rights heroes, now held the stories of a community awakening. It was the hub for something much larger than one case. Her voice, unyielding and powerful, began to carry further than ever before. She spoke to reporters, calling out not just Officer Dunn, but the system that allowed him to act with impunity. She exposed his history of complaints, his track record of excessive force. She knew the moment would come when the entire world would hear her. Her words would echo, but more than that, her actions would force change. "I'm not backing down," she said to the cameras one day, her voice steady. "This isn't just about Malcolm. This is about the entire system. This is about every person who has been silenced, every person who's been told they don't matter." And the world listened. The video of Officer Dunn's fall went viral, spreading across social media, shaking the foundations of a system built to protect the very people who use their power to oppress. Protests erupted nationwide. People began to rise up, not just in the streets, but in their hearts. The battle for justice had found its fuel. But for Amira, it wasn't enough. She had won the fight for Malcolm's freedom, but the real fight was against the very institution that had birthed the injustice in the first place. The courtroom drama was only the beginning. As Malcolm's trial turned into a landmark moment for police reform, Amira stood tall beside him. She knew it wasn't just about the court case. It was about every law, every policy, every small gesture of accountability that had yet to be fully realized. Then came the moment. The surprise twist that sent the courtroom into a frenzy. An anonymous officer, tired of seeing the truth buried, leaked body cam footage from the night of the incident. The footage proved what Amira had known all along. Officer Dunn had been the aggressor. He had been the one to escalate, to hurt, to abuse power. The tide of the case turned in an instant. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. The defense's case crumbled before their eyes. Amira watched, her heart pounding, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. She had known this moment would come. She had known that the truth was unstoppable. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even louder. They weren't chanting for Malcolm anymore. They were chanting for justice, for accountability, for every person who had ever been pushed down by a system that refused to acknowledge its own failings. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, but when they returned with their verdict, not guilty, it was as if a weight had been lifted off the shoulders of everyone who had been wronged. Malcolm was free, but Amira, her eyes scanning the room, knew that their work had just begun. This wasn't just about one officer or even one city. This was about systemic change. The courtroom erupted into applause, but Amira remained stoic. She wasn't celebrating. Not yet, she knew better. The real battle was about to take place outside, in the streets, in the halls of power. "Victory is sweet," she said softly to Malcolm as they stepped outside. "But the fight is far from over." The streets outside were alive, with voices raised in victory. But Amira could feel the weight of what was still to come. The battle for justice, for equality, for real, lasting change was still ongoing. But for the first time in her life, she felt like the movement had momentum. She watched as Malcolm, now an activist in his own right, spoke with others, using his newfound voice to speak out against the systems that had once silenced him. The ripple effect was growing. The movement was growing. The city was alive with the energy of change. Amira walked through her neighborhood, her heart swelling with pride. The people who had once looked at her with fear now greeted her with respect. There was no more hesitation in their eyes. The young girl standing on the corner, holding a protest sign, looked up at her with admiration. The girl couldn't have been older than 10, her small hands gripping the cardboard tightly. Amira smiled at her. She had never felt prouder. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now the next generation was ready.